Fantastic. So we're going to give a big welcome to United Communities Community Spotlight interviews. This month for Black History Month, we're going to be interviewing local leaders. Today, 2 of our teams will be interviewing author, educator, and speaker Glen Mourning. I'm going to go ahead and step back and I'm going to let them introduce themselves.
My name is Alhaji and I'm 14 years old.
And my name is Kylie and I'm 13 years old.
Tell me more about yourself.
All right, so Alhaji and Kylie. Did I pronounce your names correctly, right?
Yeah.
So nice to be talking to both of you tonight. I guess normally when I say anything about myself, I usually start with this idea that where I am today wasn't possible or wouldn't have been possible without the community programs in my own hometown, at the Harambee Center in Danbury, Connecticut, where I'm from. If it weren't for obviously my grandparents and my mom, I had a mentor that was very instrumental in just helping me stay on track once I hit middle school. And teachers. I became a teacher because of the fact that the most influential people that I had been, influenced by perhaps were teachers themselves. So I grew up in Danbury, Connecticut. I played sports and, just like most kids wanted to be a superstar in the NFL or the NBA and things like that. And I was introduced to this idea of college and how if you wanted to be anything outside of an entrepreneur, perhaps, that college for the most part was just one of the routes to take, especially as it relates to sports and going professional in a sport like football. So I went to college at the University of Connecticut on a full athletic scholarship. And right after I graduated, I became a teacher in Connecticut, where I then ended up transitioning down to teaching in DC, which then brought me over to Alexandria, Virginia, and teaching at Fort Hunt currently.
If it wasn't for teaching, what would you choose for a job?
If I wasn't teaching, I would probably go on auditions to be growing up. I don't know if you guys are young enough or old enough, but the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air was coming on, like new episodes were coming on when I was a kid, right? I wanted to be like Will Smith in that show so bad to where, I grew my hair out like him back in the late 90s and the early 2000s. I memorized every line of the song Summertime. If you haven't heard it, go check it out, especially when it gets warmer. It's like it's an iconic song in the Black community. But yeah, I would try to act, man. I would try to go ahead and just go to every casting call to try to be as close to Will Smith and like a Denzel Washington as possible. Like that would be my, and to be honest with you, that dream isn't even dead, right? Like until I'm no longer breathing, that's still a possibility if I try and go after it.
What does being Black mean to you?
I think, especially now that social media and technology has kind of caught up to sharing more of the common struggles in minority communities, right? Were people of color mistreated in this country for as far back as, the 1700s? Of course, right? But now more than ever, you can find out something that happens in, let's say, Minnesota or, California, like something tragic. You could find out what happens like minutes or even seconds, and sometimes even live right? Like while it's happening now because of technology. So because of that, my goal is to allow people to make sure that they have an opportunity to see someone who is a Black male, who is as sharp as can be, right? Like, I don't like making mistakes. And when I do make mistakes, I need to make sure that I'm learning something from it to apply that to my life to make myself and those around me better, right? So being Black is not just like a, it's not something I take lightly. It's not something that, is just, you can't change what you are and who you are, right? But you can always add on to your legacy or what you want to leave behind. So for a quick example, I have friends who, although have made poor choices with their lives and have ended up, let's say, like, in prison or in challenging situations where they can't really get great jobs and things like that, you always have to remember that people are watching you. And if that's all the community knows people that look like me end up doing, then when they see me, they can make an assumption that I might be in that same situation, right? So you have to remember that people are watching you, kids are watching you, adults are watching you, and you're a role model regardless of what you choose to do, because of the fact that eyes are always on you, especially being a Black male. So for me, being Black means to be responsible, not only for myself, but to make sure that the choices I make will allow other people to see other Black men with the same type of respect and dignity, right?
How did you jump from sports to writing books?
I don't think that I jumped from one or the other, right? Even as an athlete, being an athlete is a part of your story, right? It's a part of who you are. Some people identify with being an athlete, right? Especially if you take it to college and you take it even further and become a pro, it becomes a part of who you are. And sharing who I am and what I've gone through has always been a part of my life experience. So regardless if I'm meeting someone for the first time or I'm teaching a class with the kids, I've always shared my stories about the life that I've lived in hopes of teaching people lessons that I've learned from mistakes that I've made. So it was easy for me to then figure out a way to put some of the words that I already share with people to be encouraging, to put those, into actual books. And one day in 2012 or 13, I just decided to try to figure out how to make that a reality, right? Like, you are in school for a long time and you go to the library and you see books all over the place, but not once did I ever think, like, how can you physically make a book? Until I just Googled it one day and, like, there it was, right? So that's a whole nother conversation in terms of becoming an author and becoming a published author and things like that. But I've always considered myself a storyteller. I've always considered myself someone who connects with the community, and putting my words onto paper was just a natural next step for me.
What do you know about the civil rights movement?
So as a 4th and 5th grade language arts teacher in Connecticut, before I moved down to DC, I had put together a program and a curriculum called they called it a couple of different things, but in short, it had to do with the school to prison pipeline. And it's not something that a lot of people in the Fairfax community seem to talk about as much as you would in, like, DC or in Chicago or in Hartford, Connecticut. But I started to do some research to figure out, like, why are prisons overly populated with African American and Hispanic men, like men of color, right? Why are schools in big cities full of children of color that are struggling at reading and writing? And the questions that I kept asking kept leading me to different legislation or different laws that were created in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s that led all of those people who were living that struggle to finally organize to put together what we now refer to as the civil rights movement of the 1960s, right? The most important thing that I can share about the civil rights movement is the fact that some of the things that folks were still fighting for then, or were fighting for then, are still issues that have yet to be resolved now, right? There's this idea that because schools were separate but equal, that, you know, there's no excuse for people of color to say we didn't have access to education. Statistically speaking, and, you know, you can find this, you know, to be true in a lot of cases, schools were overly populated, schools were not as funded, schools had limited resources for children of color, et cetera, et cetera. And that kind of sparked more curiosity for me to continue to learn about what was taking place in the late 50s, 60s, and even into the 70s. So more than anything, like I said, it's just this idea that during the civil rights movement, there were, you know, key stakeholders and folks who were rooted in the community that were out, obviously marching, obviously protesting, obviously trying to advocate for their communities. But there's a misconception that the issues that were being kind of resolved then don't exist anymore in 2022. And there are still a ton of things that people like yourselves, young people of color, need to get out and figure out how to solve these problems, you know, in terms of the housing situation for minorities, education for minorities, the opportunity for folks to have, you know, access to healthier groceries in the communities that some of us have come from, right? So, you know, it's a collective effort from a lot of different people. And believe it or not, you know, we celebrate Dr. King now, but him as one of the kind of pioneers, you know, of that era, he was not a well-respected figure during the challenges of the civil rights movement, right? Like, a lot of people have to remember, like, he was murdered as opposed to someone who just worked really hard and died of old age, right? So, you know, things that were in place, which caused a lot of uprising, don't be blind to the fact that we still have a lot to do and there's still so much work to be done. And young folks, especially like yourselves at 13 and 14, can be major factors and major players in the solutions to a lot of the issues that we're facing now.
What advice do you have for teenagers?
What advice do I have for teenagers? I mean, it depends, because you can give someone all the advice in the world, but if they have different interests and a different perspective on what it means to be a human, then sometimes your advice can kind of land on deaf ears, right? But overall, what I would say for people that are in their teens is that you don't have to be afraid of being yourself, right? I think that, you know, just from watching some of my relatives who are younger, around your age, I think that it's really easy to try to put on this front and try to be like a tough kid, or to, you know, to act like you enjoy certain things that your peers enjoy or participate in, right? Like, when I was a teenager, I liked watching Discovery Channel and playing football, but all of my boys wanted to try to sneak out late and kind of hang out with the girls at McDonald's and go to the mall and walk around and just, you know, follow the crowd, right? And had I done that, I would have, it would have prevented me from being able to study as well as much as I did in high school. I wouldn't have graduated with a 4.0 from a very challenging high school in the state of Connecticut, in one of the wealthiest counties in the country, in Fairfield County. I wouldn't have been the, you know, the starting quarterback of my high school for 3 years in a row as a sophomore, junior, and a senior. I wouldn't have went to college for free. I wouldn't have become the teacher of the year in Connecticut. There's so many things that would not have happened had I tried to be like other people. So, you know, to answer your question, never be afraid to say no to something that you're unsure of, and to trust your heart and do what's right as much as you can. Because some things you're going to try, and just because you're young, you're going to be like, you know, I'm not hurting anybody. I'm going to try this. I'm going to try that. You know, I'm going to go over this person's house. You know, they said we're going to hang out and do this. Like, some of those things you have to figure out on your own. But if it feels like people are making you do something that you don't want to do, then that's a red flag to where you might be just hanging with the wrong crew.
What makes you make why did you make books?
Why did I write why did I? So let me ask you this. It's Alhaji, right? So let me ask you a real life question. When you were in elementary school, and you could be honest, and maybe maybe we'll see where this goes. But when you were in elementary school, did you enjoy reading? Did you like get excited to read when it was like, it's time to read, everyone, go find your book, go find a corner in the spot in the rug? Like, how did you feel when you were in elementary school?
I never touched a book.
You said you never touched a book. Is that what you said? Okay.
Like
Yeah. So
like sometimes I will, but most time not.
So believe it or not, Alhaji, you're not alone in that space of being, for one, a boy that didn't necessarily enjoy reading, but being a young Black boy who didn't ever touch a book in school, right? Just kind of using the words that you used. I recognize that not just in one kid, but in an entire school of young Black boys and girls in DC. And the idea that you don't want to learn is different from you not wanting to read a book when it was time for independent reading. So let me ask you a second question. Do you want to be smart and successful? Right? So what we do as teachers sometimes is we say, the kids who are silently reading and they're always doing all their work, and when it's time to read, those are the good kids, and those are the kids that are going to get the good grades because they care about getting good grades. Now, even though you said you didn't want to read, you also just told me that you do want to get good grades and you do want to be successful, but you just didn't want to read a book, right? So I questioned and I did surveys for hundreds of Black and brown boys in the city, and even the girls. And the number one thing that kept coming up was they didn't have books that they actually cared about, right? So where most students were like, oh, I want to read Harry Potter. Oh, I want to read Percy Jackson. Oh, I want to read Diary of a Wimpy Kid. Or some of the kids that come from the parts of town or from the neighborhoods where I was working, those type of books didn't interest them. Not to say they weren't great books and the authors aren't fantastic, but that wasn't the reality that most of the kids I was teaching was going home to, right? Like, if you're anything like me, I was going home to no food in the house. I was going home to a whole bunch of kids running around a tight, crammed up apartment. I was going home to somebody yelling about something all the time, sharing a room with maybe a cousin that was only there for one half of the school year, you know, not having somebody to wake me up on time or take me to practice. You know, my dad was never around. Like that was my scenario, not Harry Potter and, you know, Hogwarts. Like I had no connection to that. So I created books to reflect the lives that kids that I was working with come from. So the stories that I write, when kids who don't want to read start reading them, they're like, Dad, like this book Like, I feel like I'm this character in the book. And once you have a connection and you can make, this, I'm going to use the word connection again, but once you make a connection with what you're reading, you can get more, there's more buy-in, right? There's more like, well, I don't really like reading, but I do like this book, or I do like these stories, or, this character does sound cool and interesting. So let me keep reading to figure out what happens next, right? So the reason for writing books was not just because I saw kids that didn't want to write books, but if you're not reading and you're not learning how to communicate and you're not learning how to access information, then those are skills that you're going to need for the rest of your life. So I wanted to create a tool where students could learn necessary skills to be successful in every other space, not just in a reading classroom, right? But to be able to build vocabulary, learn how to think critically, learn how to have a conversation and speak professionally to someone, right? So reading, as an avid reader or someone who reads all the time, those things naturally happen when you are always looking for something else to learn about and read about. So that's kind of, the long story for why I became an author and a part of my mission as an author.
What inspired you to make books?
Just knowing the power of.
And then who's your favorite author?
Oh, my favorite author. Okay. I saw this question yesterday, and it's hard to pick one, but have you guys ever heard of the book Hatchet? Have you ever seen Hatchet? Y'all did go. Where y'all go to school? Who went to Fort Hunt? Both y'all went to Fort Hunt? Oh, I know y'all wasn't reading, because Hatchet is a book that you're supposed to read in the 5th grade. Oh my goodness. So neither one of y'all remember Hatchet? Okay, so Hatchet is by Gary Polson. And Gary Polson is a writer who does a lot of nature. He writes about nature and surviving in nature. And growing up in like a city, I never really explored living in camping and being in the woods and hunting and all of that stuff. So when you read a Gary Polson book, you feel like you're really in the forest with any of his characters, especially when you read Hatchet and you're with Brian Robeson, who is this 11-year-old boy who actually survives a plane crash, and he has to live for a few months in the Canadian wilderness all by himself. And it's like, it's the craziest scenario. It's almost like there's no way he could make it. And then I don't want to give it away, but you guys should read it. But one of my favorite authors is Gary Polson. Another one would be, y'all heard of Magic Treehouse? A lot of you talk about some, yeah, I know those books because they're easy to read. But the Magic Treehouse stories are by Mary Pope Osborne, and she is, another just iconic author, children's author. She writes about Jack and Annie in Camelot, and she's definitely one of my favorites to read about, and watching kids read her stories too.
This is our last question. Why is it so important to invest in our youth?
Do you want somebody that can't read taking care of you when you're older? Giving you the wrong medicine, giving you the wrong treatment? No, but seriously, if I didn't have, like I said, like I started the interview, right? Oh, that's Siri. If I didn't have my coaches and my grandparents and teachers kind of stick with me when I made mistakes and was just learning and growing and just becoming a young man at back when I was growing up, I wouldn't have had any success in terms of having gone to school or, you know, starting a business or becoming an author or starting a family or anything like that. And we're only as strong of a community as like the weakest people in the community, right? So if we leave a whole bunch of kids who may be struggling with, you know, different things from anxiety, depression, or, you know, trauma or whatever, if we just let them be and just leave them hanging, eventually whatever they're going through, they're going to take it out on someone somewhere, right? So if we're not supporting the people that need the most support, then as an entire community, as a country, we're going to fail. So it's just the work that has to be done. You know, there's no way around it.
Thank you for sitting down with us. We really appreciate your words and your time.
Yeah, this was awesome, man. I hope you two are working hard and you have just a rock star rest of what grade? So 8th grade and 7th grade. Is that where you guys are right now? Am I
Yes.
close? Okay. So high school is around the corner. So listen, if people tell you that middle school doesn't count or your grades don't matter right now, just block all that out, because what you're really doing is you're starting to develop habits. So make sure that the habits that you're developing include, you know, being around the right people, getting enough sleep, eating healthy, being active in the community, even as a young person, right? Volunteering, you know, reading, doing what you need to do. So you want to have as many opportunities in your futures as possible. You don't want to only be able to do 1 or 2 things because you didn't work hard when you should have been working hard. So, you know, hopefully you guys will end up being on this end of the call when you're older, giving young people advice, you know, and, you know, continuing to pay it forward. All right. So thank you guys. And if I don't, I'm not too sure if I'm allowed to sign out, but this was awesome, and I hope to see you guys soon.
Thank you. Bye.
All right.